came all the way from California to be with us today. However, he was so excited to come here because Mike grew up in Appleton and went from the tech company to be an author, because being an author is way cooler than tech, right?
Yes, absolutely. I'll say that.
Always. So I'm glad that you turned to become an author and are not tech anymore, because then we get all your great literature to read and enjoy. So thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I have kind of a jury rig set up here. If I've got a camera going, a projector going, I'll probably be blocking the screen most of the time. And I got to crouch down and touch my laptop. So it's going to be interesting. So the book just came out in mid-August, and I've been doing a bunch of book events all around the country, a bunch in San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, New York, etc. This event is a little bit different than those, because in all those events, the format was usually sort of like an interview conversation style, and this is more presentation style. So depending on how this goes, this is either going to be a world debut or you all are guinea pigs in this experiment. But as Catherine mentioned, I grew up here in Appleton, pursued a career in tech in Silicon Valley for a long time, and ultimately became a novelist. So I wanted to give a little bit of the story of that journey and how I got there. So the first question that a lot of people ask if they haven't read the book, there's a little opening description of this, but what is a bit flip anyway? And I like to say that I think I sometimes came up with the name for the book before I actually wrote any words in the book. A bit flip is sort of a technical term in binary code, which is sort of the most basic language of computers. A bit can either be one of two things, a 0 or a 1. And when it changes, it's called a bit flip. And so I really always kind of grasped onto that term as an interesting metaphor for a change of heart, a 180-degree change of heart. And it's depicted in the back of my book cover by this U-turn on the road. So I, gravitated towards that term not only because of, that was the story I wanted to write. I wanted to show my protagonist going through that change. It was a change that I was personally going through at the time as well, from the career in tech that I pursued to becoming a writer. So I thought it'd be interesting to give a little of the backstory of how I got there. And I like sharing this story. It has sort of a Midwestern vibe to it. That it all started with a chicken hatchery. So I grew up I'm like not quite born and bred. I was born in Kentucky technically, but from 2 years old I went to Edison, I went to Roosevelt, I went to East High School, all Appleton through and through. My dad, who's in the back, was from Michigan. My mom was from Minnesota, and so they settled in Wisconsin naturally, halfway in between, right? I ended up going to Northwestern for undergraduate in Chicago. And kind of the first time I had that spark of like, maybe it'd be interesting to be a writer was a creative writing class that I took in undergraduate. And I tragically can't remember the name of my teacher. I need to get my transcript and figure out that person's name. But there was a prompt in that class to write something sort of from your childhood that had a big influence on you. And I worked a day at my grandfather's chicken hatchery in Minnesota with my uncle Tommy, my cousin Tommy. And it was an eye-opener, I will tell you, for growing up in the big city of Appleton. This is farming. I mean, this is hardcore survival of the fittest sort of stuff, and it had a big impact on me. And there's actually an ode to this, an homage to this in the book around page 100. But I sort of chickened out, honestly. I realized at the time, even though I enjoyed writing, I felt like I probably couldn't make a living as an author. Now that I've become an author, I've determined that's 100% true. You cannot make a living as an author. As the old joke goes, how do you make a small fortune in the author business? Start with a large fortune. It's kind of financially punishing. But I did love to write, and so I got into sort of writing adjacent occupations. I got into public relations. I ended up going to Capitol Hill. I was interested in politics, and so I wrote speeches and press releases and things like that. And then I got exposed to this thing that at the time was called the information superhighway, a very wonky term, which of course went on to become the internet. And I wasn't really enjoying Capitol Hill. I sort of thought this internet thing seems like it might be kind of a big deal. And so I got really interested in pursuing that and ended up in working for a public relations agency where our main client was the regional Bell operating companies. These were the Baby Bells, if anyone remembers the Baby Bells. So when they broke up AT&T, you may remember here in Wisconsin, it was Wisconsin Bell, then it was Ameritech, then it was still Ameritech, just with a different logo, then it was SBC Ameritech, and then eventually it was AT&T again. They came full circle to subject us to ads with Matthew Stafford in it, which is quite painful as a Packer fan. But he is, I will note, only 7-14 lifetime against the Packers, so Matthew can sit down. But doing all this sort of propaganda for these companies that were at the time sort of the tech companies of their era, the telecom companies of their era, I was really drinking the Kool-Aid. I mean, I was like, this is it. This is the future. I really want to get into this. And so I convinced my then newlywed wife. It wasn't too hard because she actually grew up in Northern California, but we both got into UC Berkeley for business school. And so we literally, packed up the U-Haul and moved across country, which was quite a move. We, somewhere around Amarillo, Texas, our U-Haul caught on fire. This is not an actual picture of our U-Haul. We didn't have camera phones back then, or I would have done a picture. It wasn't quite that level of conflagration, but it was a little scary to see everything you own in one truck starting to smolder. But we did eventually get it extinguished and get into all our possessions moved into another truck. And there's an ode to this in the book that I was going to read a couple passages from the book, if I can find them, where I just distinctly remember this moment after maybe sleep deprivation of 5 days of driving across the country, but of like coming into Silicon Valley for the first time. And Sam, the character, talks about this as well. So I'll read you this. He's on stage, by the way, at an event that he's about to freak out at. But Sam's thoughts suddenly flash back to his first glimpse of the San Francisco Bay, framed by the glow of the setting sun as he descended from the Altamont Pass in his U-Haul from college, breaking away from his Midwestern familial obligations to pursue a career in Silicon Valley. It was his Eden, a land where brilliant young entrepreneurs conjured transformative products, disrupted every facet of the global economy, and generated overnight fortunes as a well-deserved reward. He had been so idealistic, so genuine in his belief that the dawn of the internet was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, that he was part of something bigger, part of something that was making the world a better place. That sentiment seems so distant and gullible to him now. So, that was very much how I felt. When I came to Silicon Valley, I remember the cover of Time magazine featuring Mark Andreessen, who was, the inventor of Netscape, one of the real pioneers of the tech industry, now runs a, globally known VC firm, Andreessen Horowitz. But it was just sort of like, that was the promise of Silicon Valley. It was, you're not going to Wall Street or becoming a management consultant or getting into pharmaceuticals or oil or these other industries that have these negative side effects. You're going to make a fortune and do good. You're making the world a better place. There's no downside to technology, was sort of the naivety, I think, at the time. And so I plunged right in and started working at tech companies, bigger ones when I started my career. But I sort of noticed things going from what felt like they might be wins to losses. I was at MCI in 1996. How many of you even remember MCI? I think. So we had 40,000 employees, $15 billion of revenue. It's largely a forgotten company today. Why? Because we were acquired by WorldCom, which turned out to be a giant Ponzi scheme. So Bernie Evers was the CEO of WorldCom. The company filed for bankruptcy in 2002. It was the largest bankruptcy of all time until Lehman Brothers beat them in 2008. A fairly ignominious distinction. And Bernie Evers went to jail, $11 billion fraud. So that company kind of went poof. So in 1998, I joined another company that felt like this is going to be an absolute winner. 3Com, at the time, again, big company, 12,000 employees. 3Com arguably invented the internet. They invented Ethernet protocol, which was one of the backbone technologies to the internet. They even acquired at the time US Robotics, and they owned Palm. Remember Palm Pilots? They were the predecessor. It could have been the iPhone kind of thing. They didn't know what to do with that. They divested the company. And I, as a junior product manager, was working on a network interface card, and we engineered it, and we built it, and we manufactured it, and we did all the marketing, and it was literally shrink wrapped on the loading docks, ready to go, and they canned the whole division. So myself and 200 other employees were summarily fired. We were brought into a room like this, and we were told, "You're all fired." So that was fun. And it was kind of another lesson of like, oh gosh, these things that seem like they're bedrock and established and going to be successful can be very ephemeral and disappear faster than you realize. 3Com went from 12,000 employees to 2,000 employees within about 2 years, and eventually was sold off to HP and doesn't exist anymore. So I got on the merry-go-round again. In 2000, I went to kind of a customer relationship software company called Octane Software. This was sort of the peak of the dot-com boom. We got acquired by a company called Epiphany that was public at the time. We were about to file an IPO. I mean, this was like, this is great. This is some kind of Valley dream. We got acquired for over $3 billion. I remember it was more than the market cap of American Airlines at the time. Now, $3 billion is barely anything with all these unicorn companies. But we thought we were pretty hot. And then that happened. The entire industry imploded with the dot-com bust. A lot of Epiphany's customers evaporated. So I was starting to see some patterns that were a little frustrating. But I hunkered down through the dot-com bust until about 2004, ended up in a company called Spoke Software that was doing this cool new thing called social networking. It was kind of professional social networking for your business relationships. Unfortunately, LinkedIn turned out to be the gorilla in this space, destroyed Spoke and every other company that was trying to do that. So that was pretty short-lived. My next gig was I co-founded a company called Truvizo out of, this was some really cool tech with a professor out of UC Berkeley that we were trying to commercialize. We raised money with venture capital firms. We got our first product shipped. We got our first customers, but we never really found a market for that product, and we ended up doing what's kind of called an acqui-hire, where the company buys you, and they sort of generously use that term. They're really just hiring some smart employees. So that ended up at Cisco. Then I said, I'm going to get more into the consumer internet side. That's really where the good action is. So I went to a company called High5, not super well known here, but they were like Facebook for the rest of the world. We were the first to translate into a bunch of languages around the world, and it was the #1 or #2 website in many countries. It was a top 20 website in the world in terms of traffic. Can't miss, right? This is going to be a slam dunk. Of course, 2008 financial crisis didn't help, and Facebook ended up running over us. MySpace, if you remember MySpace, Friendster, Orkut, a bunch of other social networking companies that got canned as a result of that. And it was pretty clear to me that I was definitely seeing a pattern by this point, right? It was the realization that A, this is harder than it looks. B, a lot of what my expectations were out of the space, I realized were maybe not realistic based on the odds of success, the low odds of success in that industry. And so Sam, our protagonist, is again in the opening of the book. He's been summoned by his much younger founder. He's the #2 at this company called Inetu. And the founder decides he can't possibly go to the speaking event today. I wanted, by the way, it's a corporate thriller, so I thought, people don't really get murdered at Silicon Valley companies too often, so I didn't feel like death, like true life or death fit. But I thought it'd be fun to have a scenario where, a lot of people cite this as almost their greatest fear is public speaking, right? And so Sam's thrust into public speaking, doesn't even know what he's going to be talking about, and he ends up sort of having this moment of truth saying on stage. and ends up losing his job for it. So so this is that section. He's talking in front of thousands of people. Maybe I've just been here too long and gotten a little cynical, but we're all fed this narrative about success when we come to Silicon Valley. I remember sitting out there in the audience and watching people like us talk. We use the language of humility and virtue and modesty, but really we're all just bragging. We remember how envious we felt about those lucky ones who raised big rounds or had successful exits. So now we want you to feel that same envy, that jealousy, to hold us in high esteem for our amazing accomplishments. That's the fuel that keeps the valley going. Greed and envy and pride and all the other deadly sins are the core flywheel of who we are. We may sugarcoat it in rhetoric about making the world a better place, but for the most part, that's bullshit. We're motivated by fame and fortune just like everyone else, more so than everyone else. Without your naive optimism, your willingness to take the riskiest 1 in a million bets, Silicon Valley doesn't exist. The machine stalls. The story you're told by entitled entrepreneurs and your friends at other companies and investors and the tech press is just that, a story. Ostensibly to inspire you, but in reality it entraps you. Destines you to expend your energy and creativity for the enrichment of investors. Measures you only by the size of your exits. Values you only by the esteem of others. Don't let yourself be a victim of that one narrative. So this was a fun one for me to write. In my job, I spoke at a lot of conferences, and there's definitely this performance art that happens at a conference like that, and these expectations of how you're supposed to speak, how you're supposed to act. And I always thought, wouldn't it be fun if somebody just, threw the car into reverse at 60 miles an hour on the freeway? And so I, as you can tell, at this moment in time in my career, I was getting a little cynical, a little discouraged, feeling like I'd been sort of on the merry-go-round too many times. And I would, come home and I would share these stories over the dinner table with my wife, as one does, about whatever preposterous or funny or eye-rolling thing had happened in my day. And she would sort of say, you should write a book. You should write a book. This is sort of funny. It's amusing. Like, this is what really goes on in the Valley. And I realized, that was what I felt was missing in the story of Silicon Valley. There is a ton of media coverage about the tech industry. There's a ton of nonfiction, often self-congratulatory books about the tech industry. But I felt like I just didn't really see very much fiction that, to me, depicted authentically what this world was like, this unique culture was like. And what I felt in particular was that a lot of the depictions either glorified or vilified, the people in the industry, sort of one extreme or the other. And I felt like the reality was a little more nuanced than that. The other thing that was sort of a moment for me, I love, the John Grisham thrillers and Scott Turow and, Joseph Finder and people like that, these corporate thrillers. But a lot of those people kind of come with experience. Ex-CIA people write spy novels, right? Ex-doctors write medical dramas. And I thought, well, I have a lot of experience in the tech industry, so maybe I could write something about the tech industry, so write what you know, and not write a story about chicken hatchery. So the idea was kind of percolating in my head. Again, back to that creative writing class. But I think the real aha moment for me actually happened. I'd been working at another startup that wound down, and I sort of had a rebound job at a company called Usendit that maybe some of you have heard of. It was sort of a large file sharing company. And they were kind of going through the typical ups and downs and drama. They fired the original founder and CEO, the venture investors, brought in a new CEO. That person didn't work out. They ended up getting fired. The new CEO hired me as the chief marketing officer there. And we went through, kind of a little bit of a whirlwind as there was excitement around products like Dropbox and other things out there. We raised $50 million around that enthusiasm. We changed the name of the company to Hightail to rebrand it. We spent a lot of money on ads and things like that. But the landscape was extremely challenging. There were a lot of companies that were doing sort of cloud file sharing type stuff. Many of them, by the way, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, some formidable competitors in the space. And, as we kind of continued to move sideways, the CEO who hired me got fired. I ended up as the COO. They brought the founder back to run the company. I discovered that the investors just kind of had, as VC investors sometimes do, sort of lost interest because they didn't see this as a company that could become, a huge exit for them. And so I'm like sitting there, I'm working my butt off to try and make this company successful. And even if we get it sold, we went through 2 efforts to sell the company. I personally won't really do well. It'll all go to the investors. And so it definitely led to the, what the F am I doing moment. I don't know that I want to be doing this anymore. And I was sort of debating, should I leave the company, etc. And fortunately or not, that decision was made for me. I got fired. Out of the blue, much the way the character in the book does. But this was sort of a great moment for me in some ways. And my firing was, not very interesting, not very dramatic. But it got me thinking, well, it could be dramatic, that moment. as my author brain started going. So when I wrote this scene in the book where Sam, the protagonist, gets fired, he's just been fired by this much younger founder of the company, and his replacement, he discovers, passes him in the hallway. So he kind of, again, loses it a little bit. Approaching the lobby, Sam saw the receptionist handing a chilled bottle of water to a sharply dressed middle-aged man. She led him toward the conference room as Sam passed, carrying his box of office supplies. Standing alone in the lobby, Sam waited for what seemed like an eternity for the elevator. Then there it was again, another previously unnoticed fire alarm. He intently pondered the red lever with its thin glass bar. He glanced over his shoulder, still alone, momentarily marveling at how instantaneously he had become a pariah, no one willing to associate with him. He wanted the world to stop. He wanted to undo what had just happened. He wanted to wipe Rohan's smug expression off his face, to scuttle his replacement's interview, to cast everyone scurrying down the stairwells with alarms blaring. Impulsively, he reached his hand to the alarm and yanked it downward. If he'd had his faculties, he would have anticipated what happened next. In addition to the shrill screech and flashing lights, dozens of sprinkler heads simultaneously unleashed a torrent of water. Sam was too stunned to move. He burst through the emergency exit into the descending stairwell. So Sam has a lot more, agency than I had, I guess, in some respects. But that whole incident, kind of got my creative juices flowing a little bit. I sort of started asking myself, well, what if there was some nefarious thing going on at the company that was the real reason, the executive got fired? What if they were trying to cover something up? What if there was a scapegoat? And so I kind of grabbed onto that as a premise, but I quickly kind of stalled out. I sort of had these anecdotes, these funny anecdotes. I had this premise of the firing, but I didn't really have a story. And that's when a lifeline came to me in the form of the hero's journey. This was harkening back to my creative writing days. The hero's journey is sort of a literary outline that dates to Greek mythology, where the hero's in his ordinary world. He gets called to adventure, often against his will. He finds mentors along the way, elixirs as they're called in this. Faces some big battle and sort of comes home transformed. And I was a little reluctant to use this. I thought, that's kind of cheating for me to follow this outline. But then I realized that practically every movie I've ever watched in my life uses this exact template, from Star Wars to one of my favorites, The Matrix. And once you go on Wikipedia, read about what it is, once you know it, you feel like you see it everywhere. And so that was really helpful to me. Again, as a first-time author, I realized, okay, I can use this and have sort of a roadmap to follow in putting this story together. So that was the point where I really kind of tucked into the thing. I was still working full-time, though. I was, in fact, still trying to start a new company. But I was doing this on nights and weekends, and so I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote. And the first draft was about the length of War and Peace. It was 500 some pages, way too long. But I was enthusiastic about it. I was pitching it to agents and publishers and trying to get it out in the world. And then COVID happened. And I remember kind of going, along with everyone, right? The world was kind of turned upside down. But I had this moment where I was like, I don't know if my book is, like the world I'm depicting in this book doesn't exist anymore. People don't commute to work even, So I had this moment of like, do I need to scrap the entire thing? But that whole experience really had a silver lining for me, which is 3 big things that I don't know if they would have happened if it weren't for COVID. So one is I rewrote basically the entire book. I was in a Stanford Continuing Studies class. I got paired up with this gentleman, Joshua Moore, who's a great author, but also does a side hustle of developmental editing with other authors. And that was amazing. I mean, we trimmed the book down, did a lot more character development, developed the satire in the book. We took the very last chapter and made it the opening chapter, changed the ending. It was brain surgery. But it was a lot of fun, and I felt like the book, the manuscript improved dramatically through that process. The second big one is I took the plunge and said, I'm going to be a full-time author. And this is something I truly don't think I ever would have done without COVID. I was, already working from home. My startup couldn't raise money, so we shut it down. It's like I literally am walking away from nothing to become an author right now. And so I took the time, instead of dwelling and sending out resumes, to create an author blog and start writing and develop my author brand and my content and everything else. But I was still having a hard time, frankly, finding a home for the book. And so I was kind of going down the path, thinking I'd have to self-publish it. But that ended up being my third big revelation. My editor, Josh, ended up connecting me with a publisher named Spark Press, small independent publisher. They don't really pay big, advances on books, but they've been a great partner for me. They really have a lot of expertise in the publishing space. They have traditional publishing to every bookstore in the country, and they've been a fantastic partner to work with. Now, all that said, when I signed the deal with them, it took a full year from what I thought was just done, to actually the book coming out. And that was, again, a lot of my naivety. I didn't really realize that there's all this lead up to the release of the book that you need to do to have any chance of success. A big one is you need quotes on the back of the book and on the front of the book and on the inside cover, blurbs as they're called in the industry. And other authors and reviewers need time to read your book. So it needs to go out to them, and I was blessed to have some fantastic quotes from some authors I really admire. Then you need to send it out to trade publications and get literary reviews. And this was very gratifying to start to get some 5-star reviews back. Like, holy cow! Like, I think people actually like the book. It's not in the New York Times book review yet, but maybe the next one. But this was great to get. I started working with a publicist leading up several months ahead of the book launch. And again, all these media outlets need time to look at it and review it and decide if they're going to write about it. And this was very successful. We got a ton of media coverage. Several of you mentioned you saw my interview on WFRV TV, yes, Local Live 5 yesterday, which was fantastic. Got a piece in the San Francisco Chronicle, so all of that really helps enormously. And then really kind of the most gratifying part is to have actual human readers read the book and give me their feedback. I've gotten to over 50 Amazon reviews. Only about 5 of them are direct family of mine, so that's a real win. But people seem to like it, and for me, it's really I didn't write this book. Again, I don't know that it's possible, but I didn't write this book to make money. I didn't write this book to be a bestseller. For me, the reason I really wrote the book was to stimulate a conversation, to stimulate discussion. I felt like, I describe it sometimes as a cultural critique of Silicon Valley disguised as a corporate thriller. And the response has been great. It's been really fun to do these events, have discussions, have Q&A with people, and see the exact topics that I wanted to, surface come up in those conversations. So I encourage you to buy the book. The bookstore in Appleton is doing book sales, I think tomorrow. So if anybody's going to the event, they're doing a pop up there or something, right? But weren't able to be here tonight because they're moving their stores. But I do have some copies of the book. You can Venmo me, you can pay me cash, you can do whatever. You can just buy it on Amazon if you don't care about the signature. But really, what I care about is not the sale. What I care about, the $18 that you spend on the book is small compared to the 9 or so hours it's going to take you to read it or listen to it. There's an audiobook available too, by the way. And that's really what I care about is people, tucking into the material, have it be thought-provoking. The ending has prompted a lot of discussion, so that's a little carrot to get you to the end of the novel. But I am, again, thrilled to be here. I talked a little longer than I wanted to. I wanted to try and only contain it to 30 minutes. But I'm happy to take as many questions as you might have. And I also thank you for those of you who might be connected to me on Facebook for indulging my constant self-promotion, and you haven't hopefully blocked me just yet. You have to get out there and hustle. So this is all part of it. So anybody have questions for me?
Mike,
Yeah.
I read a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't read business books because they're awful.
Yes.
This is great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well written and a wonderful story.
Well, a question that a lot of people ask is like, do you need to be in the tech industry to appreciate the book? And my response is sort of like, well, it's obviously a lot about the tech industry. It's the world I know, and I wanted it to feel authentic to people in that world. But it really tackles, I hope, universal themes of ambition and greed and family obligations and all sorts of things. There's also, I didn't really touch on it. The protagonist Sam is from Ohio, and I sort of joke that I picked Ohio because, again, dad from Michigan, mom from Minnesota, grew up in Wisconsin, went to school in Chicago, have a bunch of relatives in Iowa. I narrowed it down to the one Midwestern state that I didn't have a direct connection to, and then I forgot that all my wife's relatives are from Cincinnati, and then my son ended up going to school in Denison in Ohio. So now I do have Ohio connections. But that was a really important part of the book too, is that dynamic, right? Silicon Valley is a unique community in that, well, my wife happens to be sort of from there, but most people aren't from there. Most people are transplants there from somewhere else, whether it's the Midwest or the Middle East, that's a big part of the story too. There's 3 chapters in the book that where Sam goes back to Ohio, and you sort of see some of the origins of some of the emotions and motivations that he had and how those sort of became maybe contorted for him over time. So it's really, I hope at the end of the day, a human story, not a corporate story or business story. So yeah.
Has there been any pushback from previous coworkers or anybody in the tech industry that they have not appreciated something like you shine?
No, it's amazing. It maybe speaks to the self-delusion of Silicon Valley. Nobody thinks that's about them. It's like, well, that's the other people that he's talking about. But it is a question I get is like, is this based on real people? And there's a disclaimer at the front of the book that largely no, that there are little lines or quips or scenes or things that were borrowed, but all the characters ended up being kind of an amalgamation and hopefully representative of people. If anything, the response from people who've worked in the tech industry, especially if they've done it their whole career that I have, is like, God, this could be like, you wrote about my life. This is like so close. Some people have described it as PTSD, and I think there's a, in a lot of the San Francisco events, our discussion really centered around this sort of identity crisis almost that a lot of people in tech are going through, right? My protagonist, we're making the world a better place. A lot of the people who live and work in Silicon Valley aren't bad guys, right? They're not trying to create addictive apps and get our teenagers, mental health destroyed and all those sorts of things. Those are just kind of externalities or byproducts of building fast, successful companies. And I think as those things have kind of come to the forefront over the last several years, it's caused a lot of people in tech, myself included, to kind of go, wait, am I part of the problem? How can I sort of impact these things and correct these things? So, I think that's kind of something the tech industry, by and large, is pretty good at, is self-destruction, self-correction, and I think it's, for the most part, people have been pretty happy to have those conversations and have those discussions, and so far, nobody's taken it personally, but, who knows, maybe that will happen at some point. Other questions? Yeah?
I'm a big audiobook listener. Did you
Yes.
narrate your own?
This is funny. So the question, if you couldn't hear, was did I narrate my own audiobook? It was recommended to me that as the last proofread before you go to print, you should read your book out loud. And that was great advice because, man, your ear sees, like your eyes will go over stuff that your ears won't, will stall on. So I thought, well, if I'm going to read the whole damn thing out loud, I might as well record it. So there's a secret audio recording of me narrating the entire book. I got a special microphone and the whole deal. I realized through that process, I'm not going to be the narrator of this book. I really came to appreciate that it is a true skill. The gentleman who narrated it is based in Pittsburgh. He went to Carnegie Mellon as a classically trained actor, stage actor. You really, if any of your audiobooks fans, he does different voices and different, he's an actor. He acts the different parts of the role, and I can't do that at all. So I hired somebody to do that.
I just wanted to add, I'm a connoisseur of audiobooks, and I listened to the book.
Oh, great. How did you like it?
I loved it.
Oh, thank you.
You got to start with a good book.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
The narrator really makes a difference, and this guy was fantastic.
Yeah, Darren Elker is his name, and it was great. You realize I'd listened a ton of audiobooks myself, and you sort of, a good narrator almost fades into the background, if that makes sense. Like you don't think about them so much. Like it's pretty rare that books will have multiple narrators too. It's usually one narrator, oftentimes throughout, for all the different voices, and doing that well, incredibly, but at the same time, sort of subtly. It's a real art. So when I heard his voice, I was pretty sure. I had over 100 people audition for the part. So thank you.
I didn't realize that many people auditioned to do it.
I know. Yes.
You've written it, you've published it, you're promoting it. What's next?
Another book. So I've written my second novel already. It's called Burner. There's what I've realized from the first novel. There's sort of three distinct phases. There's writing the book, all the concepts and character development and everything else. Then there's editing the book, and then there's promoting the book once it's published. I love writing the book. That to me is that's a creative process. I really, I actually enjoy promoting the book because I was a marketer for much of my career, so I'm comfortable, talking and self-promoting and that sort of stuff. But editing the book was the painful part of the process for me in the first book because, everything I wrote is brilliant. Like, why would this possibly need to be changed? So that is a long process. I've about a dozen or so people that that are friends who I consider beta readers who are giving me feedback on that draft. Current timeline is roughly spring of 2024. Again, it needs to be done in 6 months to come out in 18 months, which feels like forever from now, but it's coming along quickly. And I'll give you a quick teaser. There's a little more information on my website. So my lane, my topic is tech's impact on our lives. So the first book was sort of the impact of the tech industry on our lives. This one's a little bit more technology products on our lives. And there's two protagonists, male, female. He is the leader of a somewhat underground, anonymous leader of an underground sort of populist movement. And she is an Instagram celebrity and daughter of a tech billionaire. And they are sort of secretly in love. And in the opening scene, Shane, the protagonist, male protagonist, has just been arrested for treason for a protest that spun completely out of control. And in that same protest, it opens with Chloe, the female protagonist, has been abducted by Shane's followers. So what I really liked about this story is like unintended consequences, like how, especially millennials, younger generation, live so much of their self-esteem and ego and relationships is defined by their followings and their online relationships. And is that just sort of mutually exclusive with true love is sort of the core question of the book. So it was a lot of fun to write. A challenge for me as an author. Bitflip is written sort of third person, and this is first person, dual narratives, male and female. So writing as a first person female narrator was different for me. And then there's a bunch of what are called in the writing world found objects. So as you read the book, you get a court transcript or a media article or these little bits and pieces that kind of fill in the story and make you wonder, like, am I getting the real story from the narrators, or are they unreliable? So it's a lot of fun, and again, targeting. I gave you actually way more than is on the website. I said that way more. Yeah.
You mentioned how you centered on Ohio. How did you decide on Lima?
Lima. It is Lima, correctly pronounced. Very good. I nearly made the faux pas in the audiobook of calling it Lima, Ohio, in which case I probably would have been boycotted from everybody in the state of Ohio. I mentioned, I think that Ohio, more so than Wisconsin, certainly more so than my hometown of Appleton, got this sort of whipsaw effect of the manufacturing industry, right? That town was a boom town. I mean, they actually started with, believe it or not, an oil boom in the late 1800s. That led to a manufacturing boom. They built everything from ambulances to railroad engines there. Then it just kind of retreated, right? Those businesses went out of business. The population of the town went from a peak of about 55,000 in 1970 to 35,000, just a few years later. And I actually had the privilege of visiting Lima. So in this day and age, I kind of picked it. I'd done enough research that I thought, okay, I wanted it in Ohio. This is kind of like the profile of the town I want. I walked the streets using like Google Maps and stuff like that. So I had a sense that I was depicting the town accurately, but I hadn't actually been there until I was visiting my son in college and went up to, I was like, I gotta go to Lima, and so I went to Lima, and it's had a tough go of it. I mean, the businesses in the downtown are largely abandoned. The businesses that put those businesses out of business in the suburban strip malls, those big box stores and stuff are abandoned. And it's underlying function of your population was cut in half. And so there was a lot of, I wanted all those emotions to be part of Sam's, makeup and backstory of like a little bit of guilt about leaving, a little bit of resentment from his high school friends who felt like he left them behind, a family business that he felt like he should have taken over, but his dad, really didn't want him to take it over. He wanted him to go pursue other things, and I really thought that a lot of people, not just from the Midwest, but all over the world, really go through that thought process when they think about going to a place like Silicon Valley, and that became an important part of the story. Other questions? Doing pretty well.
As a writer, how many different storylines do you think you're percolating in your head on a regular basis? Because I'm not a big tech reader.
Yeah.
But the one thing that I really enjoyed about tech, which I think is super popular right now at our library, is horror. And I think Black Mirror, right away, like that, like what you were saying, like these twisted sides that you can get from technology.
Yes.
So how many different storylines do you have, like a romance one coming out?
Yeah.
How many different ones do you like?
Right now I have the one that I've written, Burner. I have two other ideas that I'm concepting that are both generally in the same area. I mean, I think one of the things that I one of the stories is about a. I also, as you could probably tell, I sometimes borrow from other literary things that I've read that I've been inspired from. I've always been a fan of The Great Gatsby, and so this has got a little bit of a Great Gatsby-esque element to it, where it's sort of an eccentric tech mogul, a la like Elon Musk or something like that, and but told through the side character, if you will, about this sort of larger than life person that he envies and aspires to be like, and all that sort of stuff. And I really, Bigfoot has a lot of that. I like that because, if I were to talk to the 20-something me, I'd say, do things you love. Don't do things, don't get swept up in pursuing, your ideal of what some, founder or billionaire or whatever is like. And I see a lot of people in Silicon Valley doing exactly that, kind of mimicking Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or whoever it might be. There's such a mythos around those people, and it can lead to some really bad behavior and kind of not quite self-destructive behavior, but self-loathing almost, right? I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley completely lose sight of the fact that what they're doing is infinitesimal odds, right? It's like the startup you're joining or founding is 99.9% likely going to fail. And yet I did, and most people in Silicon Valley feel like if I'm not selling this thing for $1 billion, like I'm a failure. I didn't live up to my own expectations. So those are some of the themes that I want to have in the books, in the future books. So it's really those 2 or 3 ideas that I've been percolating around in my head. So my goal is to write 10 books. That is my current self-stated goal. 10 novels. In the next hopefully 10-ish years. They take a little bit longer than a year a novel, but I'd love to get into that kind of thing. Maybe I'll have to hire some ghostwriters or something to crank them out a little faster. Do it like Tom Clancy style. So, any other? We probably have time for one more. Anyone? All right. Well, so again, I don't feel obliged to buy a book. Normally I would pitch you hard on buying a book because I want the bookstores to make money off the book. But I do have books. I'm happy to sign books if anybody wants one. There's little QR codes on that poster if you can see them. If you want to, you can Venmo me. You can just buy it directly from Amazon, whatever's easiest for you. Or again, you can buy it tomorrow from the bookstore. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.